Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e5. Knight g1 to f3. Knight b8 to c6. Bishop f1 to c4. Knight g8 to f6. Knight f3 to g5. Pawn d7 to d5. Pawn e4 takes d5. Knight c6 to a5. Bishop c4 to b5, check. Pawn c7 to c6. Pawn d5 takes c6. Pawn b7 takes c6. Bishop b5 to e2. Pawn h7 to h6. Knight g5 to f3. Pawn e5 to e4. Knight f3 to e5. Queen d8 to d5. Pawn f2 to f4. Pawn g7 to g5. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn e4 takes d3. Queen d1 takes d3. Rook a8 to b8. Bishop e2 to f3. Queen d5 to e6. Castle kingside. Bishop f8 to b4. Bishop c1 to d2. Pawn c6 to c5. Knight e5 takes f7. Queen e6 takes f7. Rook f1 to e1, check. Bishop c8 to e6. Bishop d2 takes b4. Pawn c5 takes b4. Pawn f4 to f5. Rook b8 to b6. Pawn f5 takes e6. Queen f7 to e7. Knight b1 to d2. Pawn g5 to g4. Bishop f3 takes g4. Rook h8 to g8. Bishop g4 to f3. Queen e7 to c5, check. King g1 to h1. Rook g8 to g7. Pawn a2 to a3. Pawn b4 takes a3. Rook a1 takes a3. Rook b6 to d6. Rook a3 takes a5. Rook d6 takes d3. Rook a5 takes c5. Rook d3 takes d2. Rook c5 to c8, check. King e8 to e7. Rook c8 to c7, check. King e7 to f8. Pawn e6 to e7, check. Rook g7 takes e7. Rook e1 takes e7. Rook d2 takes c2. Rook c7 takes c2. King f8 takes e7. Rook c2 to c7, check. King e7 to e6. Rook c7 takes a7. King e6 to f5. Pawn b2 to b4. King f5 to e5. Pawn b4 to b5. Knight f6 to d5. Bishop f3 takes d5. King e5 takes d5. Rook a7 to c7. Pawn h6 to h5. Pawn b5 to b6. King d5 to d6. Rook c7 to c8. King d6 to d5. Pawn b6 to b7. King d5 to a6. Pawn b7 to b8, promoting to queen. King e6 to d5. Queen b8 to b5, check. King d5 to d4. Rook c8 to c4, check. King d4 to d3. Queen b5 to b3, check. King d3 to d2. Rook c4 to c2, check. King d2 to d1. Queen b3 to b1, checkmate.